Welcome to COIQ, a first-of-its-kind video program about health innovators, early adopters, and influencers, and their stories about riding the roller coaster of healthcare innovation. I'm your host, Dr. Roxy, founder of Legacy DNA Marketing Group, and it's time to raise our COIQ. Welcome back, COIQ listeners. On today's episode, I have with me Michael Eckhardt. He is the managing director for the Chasm Institute. And this episode is going to be slightly different. We are going to be diving a lot deeper than we have maybe in the past around the commercialization strategy that health innovators use and the different stages of that process and the strategy that's developed. So, Michael, welcome to the show.
Great. Thanks, Dr. Roxy. Hey, great to be here. And I heard a lot of great things about the people in your audience and all the healthcare and medical focus that you all have. So delighted to be here and looking forward to the chat.
Great. So one of the things that I like to do is to just kind of kick off for listeners who don't know who you are and aren't familiar with your background is to have you just start off the conversation by sharing a little bit about what you do and,
Sure.
and a little bit about your background.
Sure. Yeah, happy to do that. So name is Michael Eckhardt. I've been working in disruptive innovations and going to market with new commercialization strategies. It's actually flown by very quickly, actually closer to 20 years. And the sole focus has really been helping both new ventures that are fundamentally new startups, but also within larger companies, the Philips of the world, the Becton Dickinsons and so forth on healthcare and others, to really take innovation in a way that speeds things to market in an effective way. And so we built tools around that. We've written some books. If some of your listeners or viewers might have heard of our Crossing the Chasm book, came out more than 15 years ago. We're happy to report it sold about 3 million copies in that time period, which is not a lot, by the way. Harry Potter sold 3 million books on like Tuesday afternoon
Right.
During his boom time. So, but we think they've gotten in the right hands of entrepreneurs in medtech, in healthcare, in IT, and other areas. And so that's really been our focus, based here in Silicon Valley and, working worldwide, but really love the work and see the impact of it on a regular basis, which is great.
Yeah. So you and I have had some really rich discussion around the diffusion of innovation theory. And so just to kind of go a little bit deeper, what do you mean by the chasm?
Got it.
What does it mean to cross the chasm?
Yeah. So Crossing the Chasm is the name of the book, but more importantly, the concept is, as you, Dr. Rox, you're asking about it, it's really how do you get from the early, enthusiastic, visionary, risk-taking customers, which only represents about 5 to 8% of the overall market in most technology-based businesses, to what we call the mainstream market, the real market, the place where there's pragmatists, conservatives, people under regulatory requirements, much of that in healthcare and others, and really taking early breakthrough solutions that can't just remain breakthrough, but actually have become pragmatic, what we call whole products, to solve real workflows, real pain points, real physical and workflow-based product lines and problems. So that's really where we go with this. And the chasm is the delay between the early market actually adopting to something and later. So you hear a lot of buzzwords, IoT and AI and distributed computing and things in medtech and in healthcare. A lot of that noise is about early market things, but that doesn't necessarily mean that main marketplace customers are actually buying and using.
Right.
And so what our books do is really build a set of predictive models that allow you to take the excitement from the early market, which is not enough to fuel adoption from our customers, actually get it across. And that's what we've done for about, we just counted up the other day, about 225 companies in the last 15 years has helped them cross this chasm into the main marketplace.
I think that's fantastic. Our listeners probably have heard me talk about this stat very, very often, that over 90% of innovations that are brought to market fail to reach any adequate level of profitability or customer adoption. So, the work that you do, the work that we do is so needed in the marketplace. So it's great to see how you've been able to help hundreds of companies be more successful.
Yeah, it really is very rewarding. I mean, it's work that I've been doing, and people sometimes ask, hey, Michael, after a while, you and your Chasm Institute, don't you get bored working on the same problems all the time? And my answer is every week, literally, Dr. Roxy, we learn new applications for what we did. We did not start out in healthcare and medtech. We started off in IT and software and computing, but almost 20 years ago. And then in the past 15 years, things like medical device, AEDs, and things like patient monitoring equipment, and things like FDA software requirements for new drug trial results, all those kind of drove adoption into other areas. And in fact, you and I had a conversation a few weeks ago about Clayton Christensen, who's a Harvard Business School professor, who I know you've done a lot of reading and took a course there as well. And my MBA is actually from Harvard, and that's many years ago. But ever since then, I've been focused on how do you take a fundamentally breakthrough new solution, we call those, of course, disruptive innovations, and bring those to market. That's really the secret sauce, as we should call it. And it turns out that there's actually 9 ways to fail in doing that. We can talk about that a little bit later in the podcast.
Yeah.
But it turns out that those 9 ways, only one of those has to do with product. There's so much obsession around, oh my God, is the product ready? And of course, that's a key question. But there's 8 other indicators of failure or success when you go to market. And so that's really the learning that we've had, both in our books, but more importantly, in the workshops and the podcasts and everything else that we've done. So I think you and I are pretty closely aligned that there's still some good work to be done in this area.
Absolutely. And enough work to go around, that's for sure.
Yeah.
So for our listeners who don't know some of the concepts that just really roll off our tongue, how would you describe the difference between bringing a innovation to a high-tech innovation to market versus other market solutions?
Yeah.
What are some of the distinctions?
Great. Well, and as we all know, who's on this podcast, there's buzzwords floating around in the ether way too much, including words like disruption, breakthrough, innovation. Those are all, if I hear those one more time, I sometimes feel like that. Right. Exactly. And we have a very specific definition of what we call disruptive innovation versus what we call incremental innovation or what we call sustaining innovation. They're both valid.
Yep.
They're very different in terms of who's ready to buy and use those. And by disruptive innovation, this is something that you and I hadn't talked about a few weeks ago, but disruptive, we actually have 3 specific definition factors that cause your product or solution to be disruptive or not. So disruption is used in many, ill-conceived ways. My stomach's feeling a little funny. I must have had a disruptive breakfast this morning.
Nice.
Or my father-in-law was once again disruptive at the holidays. Those are all interesting uses, but our definition is software, hardware solutions are disruptive if 2 out of these 3 indicators are a yes or a strong yes. One of those is there a change in behavior required by the customers in that target segment?
Yeah.
Change in behavior. Do they have to do something differently or think differently? Secondly, is there a change in skill required by the customers who are going to use this product? And then third, is there a change in process or workflow required? Mm-hmm. So change in behavior, change in skill, and change in workflow. And what we've seen in the 225 examples of the companies we work with is that if 2 out of those 3 are a yes or a strong yes, then you're not going to the mainstream marketplace right away. The market will deny you that opportunity because it's not ready to adopt. An example would be artificial intelligence. Mm-hmm. AI has been in the early market for decades, and it's finally crossing. It's finally crossing in 2 areas: voice recognition and cybersecurity. And there's some healthcare applications too that are being talked about, but not yet fully baked for the main marketplace. Other things like devices, think of an Apple phone with extended better battery life. That's not a disruptive innovation. That's a sustaining innovation. Now, the engineers at Apple working on the battery life might have been working very hard and had some technology breakthroughs. But for the customer, for you and me, it would be, hey, cool, the battery's now 50% longer lasting. No change in behavior, no change in skill, no change in workflow for me. So that goes right to what we call main marketplace. And so those companies that confuse those 2 get so excited about disruptive ones, thinking they can adopt those into the main marketplace immediately. They get rejected, and then they do all the wrong things. They retrain the sales force again. They cut price. They do all these things. None of those will work. We need to do something different. That's crossing the chasm with focused, targeted segment approaches. And that's really what part of our conversation is about here today.
Yeah, absolutely. And, a lot of companies that I've worked with talk about targeting strategy, but in a different context. So the lens that they're looking through is maybe, especially in healthcare, is the difference between a user versus a buyer, right? Versus someone who's going to prescribe it, right?
Yep.
And so they have a tendency to segment based upon roles or use cases and really often forget that this whole diffusion of innovation theory, right, and
Right.
the lens of really reshaping the messaging and the product offering for where
Right.
they are in that continuum.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a great way to summarize this important point that we're describing here, because it turns out this diffusion of innovation, or this life cycle, I mentioned 5 to 8% of customers are the non-normal customers. They're early adopters. They might not be physicians actually treating patients. They might be in research institutes. They might be in universities. They have a different set of pressures than somebody actually doing a normal set of diagnostics on a patient at this point. The main marketplace is then divided into what we call the early pragmatists, or early cautionary customers. That's about 30% of the market.
Mm-hmm.
The next remainder of that is about 40%, which are conservatives, which do not want to buy until they've seen 10 other clinics or physicians or other people in their city. Not in Japan, if they're in Toledo, Ohio, but in Ohio, actually defining that, using it, and recommending it. And so this is what makes the world so interesting, but also so frustrating to a founder. Some of these people might be on the podcast, or executives in large companies who say, we are so excited about this breakthrough. And the problem is, you as the vendor is more excited about the breakthrough than the customer is excited about it.
Yeah.
Especially when you think about what you just mentioned a minute ago, which is there's the patient, there's the caregivers, there's the payers, there's the institutions, there's regulators. That's a very complex ecosystem to go into.
Sure. Yeah. So I'll give you an example that happened not too long ago. I was working with a client and they were in the early phase, right? And they were piloting their solution. And they were really excited. They had a pretty big local hospital system that said, yes, they would participate in the study. And they finished the work and they had great results to promote. So they thought that was just a home run, like straight pass go, collecting their $200, right? I mean, they just thought that they were destined for success. And so they go to this other hospital system that's literally right down the road, and through the dialogue, they tell them, well, we need to do a pilot study first. And they said, oh, well, I'm so glad you want to do that, because in fact, we've done that. And here's the data of what we did at the hospital system down the road. And they said, well, no, we have a different patient population.
Yep.
And they're like, it's the same community. How do you have a different population?
Same highway off ramp, but different community, right?
Yeah.
And that's what makes this complex, both with how you work with some of your clients and what we've seen at Chasm Institute, is that the only references that customers care about are what we call relevant references. And relevance is not something we as the vendor could define.
Sure.
It's the customer themselves. And so it turns out that medtech and healthcare, and perhaps even things like pharmaceutical, each one of those three has a different set of purchasing points to go after. And so, with your permission, I'm going to use the F word a few times during the session. Don't worry. Don't worry. The word is focus.
Yeah.
Not the other word, the word focus. And it says, as you're crossing the chasm, we've now got these couple hundred examples that if you try to go broad or horizontal, you will fail. And you can do everything about it. You can double the feature set in the product line. You can retrain the sales force. You can cut price. None of those things will get you across. What the F word brings up is, can you focus on a specific set of, well, and you mentioned the word a few minutes ago, it's really about the use case or the workflow in a segment, in a specific geography that really focuses and drives things through. And so if you want, a little bit later in the discussion here, I can give you a vivid example of how healthcare actually relates into this as an example. But what I will preamble this with is the idea that if you're more excited about your product than the market is excited about the product, then you're in the chasm.
Yeah.
You're getting maybe pilot programs if you're lucky, but no true adoption, no use, et cetera. It's really just early market success, which is interesting, but not indicative of future success.
Well, and a lot of times I see companies that they end up, burning through their entire 18-month, runway because they are pitching an early adoption, an early solution to the mainstream market. And there's, like you're describing, no arm twisting, no pricing, nothing is going to persuade them to buy at that stage.
Well, in fact, if you'd like, I'd be happy to just put very briefly 2 examples out there that I think kind of resonate what you're coming up with and describing. One is a non-healthcare example and one is a healthcare and medical example. The non-healthcare one is we started working with Google about 3 years ago. They bought a company called Nest. And you might know Nest. Nest does the thermostats that you can control with your smartphone. And Nest had a very successful early stage of early market. They sold tens of millions of dollars with Nest devices. And this is basically you self-installing this thermostat in your home so you can manage your air conditioning in Florida or your heating in Minnesota without even being there, right? So remote. And now they're moving into, security cameras and other things too, of course.
Yeah.
But for the thermostat example was they sold tens of millions in the early market. Google got excited and bought them for $3 billion. We were brought in to help them cross the chasm. Turns out that the whole product, which we don't have time to get into here in the podcast, but a whole product is what's the total solution needed to solve the customer's pain point or problem in a certain workflow. They had it for the early market. They had the Wi-Fi capabilities. They had the install. They even had a screwdriver and the brackets and the screws in the box with the thermostat to allow you to assemble it and deploy it. Now, if you or I or one of your viewers on the podcast are an early adopter, you'd say to yourself, they've thought of everything. Look at this. Screwdriver, et cetera. This is awesome. Why? On Saturday afternoon, I'm going to spend some time, put this up, get it to run, and my life will be better as a result.
I'll be the first one in my neighborhood with this.
And I can brag about it a little bit too. Exactly. Hey, guess what I've got in my house that you don't yet have, right? Exactly. Right. That first mover for early customers is a big deal too at times. Now, even though this is a B2C example in the case of Nest, what they fail to recognize is that most normal people don't want to spend a Saturday installing their own thermostat in their house. Most normal people have, and people laugh when I say this, they actually have a life outside of technology. They'd rather be spending time with their family or painting or golf or something.
Yep.
So that 5 to 8%, what Nest did was misread that. And this is public information or else I wouldn't be sharing it with you.
Sure.
They misread that and thought that that was an indicator of the entire market needs. So now they launch into the main marketplace with this given true success in the early market and they fail. And the reason they fail is the whole product failed to include something that normal customers wanted in their whole product. What was that? Installation, deployment by somebody other than themselves.
Yep.
They wanted somebody in a white van to drive up to the house with a leather belt on, typically, somebody in their 40s or 50s who's done this a million times, and they're going to come in and install it for you. And Nest didn't have that solution.
That's a great example.
So the example would be they have 100% whole product for the early market, and they had an 80% complete solution for the main marketplace. And as a result, they hit that chasm without having the right solution in place. So it's a non-healthcare example, but it's vivid that sometimes it's not about the product. It's about the deployment, the install, all those things required that complete the solution for the customer, and otherwise they're not going to buy.
Right. Yeah.
Does that make sense in terms of how people sometimes misunderstand the idea about how you actually win in the early market versus the main marketplace?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So you kind of touched on this earlier, and I want to have you answer this question for our listeners. From your perspective, why is having a decision-making framework important? What are the benefits of using a model that's grounded in theory versus instincts and past experience?
Yep, great. Okay. So past experience is valuable. Don't throw that one over under the bus. But on the other hand, the past experience we see from large companies, whether they come from Johnson & Johnson or from Becton Dickinson or from other companies in healthcare, they come from large companies and start a new venture, either within that large company or on their own.
Yep.
And all the rules of engagement on what it takes to win in mature markets is the opposite of what it takes to win in early markets. And so the experience is the wrong experience, unfortunately.
Yeah.
The other piece I should mention is if you're really a lucky person and every time you go to Vegas you win and everything you've touched is turned to gold, then you don't need frameworks or tools. You can just go out there and launch a product. You've probably got about a 3% chance of winning with that. But if you're a lucky person, go for it.
Right.
If you're the other 97% of really smart people who want to hedge their bets and manage risk, then whether it's our books or some methodology needs to be used to build what we call a systematic approach to going to market. And so I'm putting a little bit tongue-in-cheek here that, hey, don't underestimate luck. It's part of every strategy.
Sure.
But if it's 80% of your strategy, then you're screwed. Quite
Yeah. Yeah.
If it's 10% of your strategy, great. And so to answer your question directly, what we've done is take the luck factor out and the gut feel out and say, we've actually put analytics in place for 9 key variables that you can score and rate and rank and look at different segments and decide which ones do you go after.
Yeah.
You know, the F word, focus on. Which ones do you hit the pause button on because they're not ready to adopt? And which ones do you actually cross off?
Mm-hmm.
I remember back to my Harvard Business School days, one of my professors said, if you haven't crossed anything off lately on your target market approach, then you don't have a strategy. You have a hope, you have a wish, you have a vision, but you need to say no to some things too. And so in a few minutes, I'll give you the other example, but your point is a really good one, that the vivid nature of why is a systematic framework helpful? It gets all the smart people on the right page and the right direction across R&D, marketing, executive management, support, product, et cetera. That's really the goal.
Yeah. That unity for a team, especially, I mean, really at any stage of the business life cycle, but that unity is just critical for success.
Right.
I mean, like you would describe earlier, you know, a company with a better product can be superseded by a company that is all working together in a single direction. The other thing that I think you touch on is setting priorities. So focus and priorities. And so, you know, every organization has limited human capital, limited resources, limited funds. Right. And so, you know, having a framework kind of helps you decide what you're going to spend your resources on and what you're going to cross off the list, right?
And it's that framework around a word that's overused, but it's about alignment. It's getting not just R&D and development, but product management, executive management, everybody on the same page. And so when sometimes I'll ask a client, you know, who are you focused on? They go, oh, we're very focused. Who are you focused on? We're focused on financial institutions. Who are they? Well, all insurers and banks and credit unions of all sizes. It's like, you're doing spray and pray. You're not focused.
Right.
Or in healthcare, it could be, well, we're going after hospital systems. Okay, that's interesting. Yeah. Large ones, mediums, smalls. Which country? In the US or in the UK? Are they small private hospitals or large public institutions? Those all have very different buying scenarios. And so our level of detail gets to the job title and the type of segment. And it may be the purchasing officers in small to mid-sized private healthcare networks in the U.S. That's the level of granularity you got to get to, as opposed to spray and pray and horizontal. Yeah,
absolutely. So, and you're kind of touching on this a little bit, but you know, what happens, you know, for those folks that don't have a framework or a model that they're following, what happens when they overlook one of those decisions? Or overlook one of those strategies, right? So I did my homework on targeting and I did my homework on pricing and maybe even the product, but I really didn't flesh out this whole partnership and alliance strategy.
Right, yeah. Well, and even though we're not working off of slides here, let me just list out the 9 criteria. And people don't need to commit these to memory. You know, there might be some slides that you can get from Dr. Roxy after the podcast if you like that we provided, or you can go to my LinkedIn page, whatever you want to do. But what this really does is say there's 9 criteria and factors for failure if you do them wrong or ignore them. They're the 9 factors for success if you get them right. The first one you mentioned a few moments ago, which is what is the target market focus you're going after? Not healthcare institutions worldwide. That's spray and pray. That's the recipe for failure.
Yeah.
By the way, I should mention, of the 225 examples of us helping companies cross the chasm in software and hardware and technology services, we have 0 examples, not 3, but 0 examples of going horizontal and broad and winning in the main marketplace. We've got 225 examples of vertical, focused, segment, systematic approach, much like what you're saying and what I think you believe in totally yourself. In fact, I know, and you didn't ask me to say this, I know you're coming out with a book here in the near term. Yeah. And I think it very much echoes and reinforces what we're talking about here as well, which is great.
Thank you. So they complement each other very well.
They do. Yeah, they're bookends to the same idea.
Yeah.
The 9 factors. 1 is, are you targeting properly? 2 is what we call compelling reason to buy. And compelling reason to buy is not just, is it worth it? Is the price point right? Is it solving a near-term problem I have, whether regulatory pressure, patient pressure, workflow problems? And if you have to explain to the target segment that they have a problem, and they don't and they don't recognize they have the problem, go find a different segment.
Oh my gosh, can you repeat that?
We see that way too much, which an executive and a founder goes, we have a new breakthrough in orthodontia or in hearing aid solutions or in medical monitoring equipment in hospitals for heart patients. The only problem is we have to educate the market on the problem because they don't get it.
Right.
My answer would be that, no, you don't get it, that they don't get it, and they're not going to get it. Go find a segment that actually cares.
Oh my goodness. Absolutely. Again, this is one of those instances where so much, I've seen companies fail because they aren't willing to look at it from the lens of their customer. Right. And just going to continue to pound everyone in that market to convince them that they have a problem.
Right.
And they run out of money before they get to the people that know they have that problem.
Right. Well, and if there is no one in the market who recognizes the problem, then it's a good idea to find some other hobby or vocation to the market. But the reality is, the sad thing is, and I think you and I talked about this, Dr. Roxy, in our call a few weeks ago, is that there's so much waste in the system where great entrepreneurs and great corporate executives are going after markets and not gaining traction because they're focused on the wrong set of pain points where customers don't get educated. They don't need to. It's the real reaction should be, what took you so long? Of course, I'm ready to adopt this. Please come forward and do this. So those are the first two, is target market segment and compelling reason to buy. The third one is whole product. Mm-hmm. And again, we won't go through these in great detail, but it's what's the total solution needed. Like for Nest, it's installation, which was missing. Fourth is really, who are the partners and allies who actually will support your whole product? Partners are people you pay to work with you to complete the whole product. Allies are journalists and bloggers and industry experts who you don't pay, but you better have them on your side.
Yeah.
Or at least neutral. The next one is your sales channel. How do you actually go to market? Is it a direct sales force? Is it VARs? Is it third-party experts? Is it some other version? And the remaining ones really drive down into things like pricing and price model, into your competition and who you're competing against, into positioning and messaging, and finally, and much more important than anything else you can think of at that point, is it's not the ninth most important one, but it's, if we win in this segment, how do we move into other segments as well? Mm-hmm. So every product line, we had the liberty of working with Philips back in the day on their AED device. And while I can't, that's the automatic external defibrillator, which is now a worldwide phenomenon. Philips has sold 3 million of these or more. I can tell you that the scoring, rating, and ranking they utilized with our help, they did all the hard work. We just provided them with the analytics and the scoring, got them to one precise segment that drove the first 50,000 out of 70,000 AED devices on the planet. And it wasn't hospitals, and it wasn't gyms, and it wasn't schools. It was airliners.
Right, right.
And airliners scored a 41 out of 45 on the 9-point scale, whereas other places was not as high a compelling reason to buy. So can't go into too many details there just because I don't want to divulge too much, but that drove it into the full set of what we'll call tornado strategy later.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yep, yep. Game changer.
Game changer, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the irony is, I think that anybody listening to your series of podcasts, whether prior ones or follow-ons ones to this or this one, if they're listening and watching, they probably already have the instinct that a systematic approach, a methodology of whatever sort they choose will be much better than the absence of one. And we have a methodology, and we work with thousands of executives, and once in a while, quite frankly, our 9-point strategy checklist or our tech market model, people looking at, and let's say we've met a few people who go, you know what, I'm not sure I believe fully in your model. And I ask them, what model or framework do you use? And they go, well, we don't have one. And I go, hey, how about this? In the absence of something better, how about do this one, which we used 225 times? They go, okay,
right.
Give it a shot. So here we are.
It's funny, you describe a phenomenon for our audience, but it's, even something that I've experienced as well, where I had a health innovator, they have an idea, right? They see a problem in the system. They've been in the system for a long time. They decided that they're going to develop a solution. So the first thing that they approach us with is they want someone to build a website and create a logo.
Right.
And I'm like, well, how about we start with strategy? before we get to the website, right? And there, after one conversation, it was apparent that that was not my customer.
Well, and as a backgrounder on this, the reason that Dr. Roxy and I are on this podcast is not the reason she reached out to me, and the reason I said yes was we are very aligned on this idea that's fundamentally about what you just described, which is of those 9 points: target market focus, compelling reason to buy, et cetera. Positioning and messaging, which includes website, is the 8th one on the list. We get plenty of emails from companies saying, we're starting a new company, we're starting a new product line, we're struggling with our positioning and messaging. Could you help us work on the logo and the messaging? And we say, those are all interesting things to do. Have you already addressed the other 7 areas above that, including your strategy? And you know what they say? They say, those other ones are really hard. We thought we'd start with product positioning first.
Right.
And this gets us back to the game show gong, the buzzer that goes, sorry, can't proceed. If you don't know who you're targeting and what problem you're solving, then you're wasting your money on websites and messaging, et cetera. And that's why you and I are pretty closely aligned on that, I think.
Yeah. So we've kind of given a number of examples, but just in case you have some other ones, getting your perspective on why you think some health innovators fail and why some succeed.
Okay, got it. The R word comes up here, which is regulatory. Mm-hmm. Oftentimes we see regulatory as the enemy because it's imposing requirements on an industry that may not always want them. The truth of the matter is sometimes regulatory requirements actually drive adoption because early adopters may buy without regulatory requirements, but the main marketplace says, wow, this new FDA regulation is coming into place on January 1st, 2020. We need to get ready for it. And so the short answer is regulatory can be your friend if you have the right position in mind in terms of how this really helps you meet and adhere to the regulatory requirements in the future. But the biggest issue was a phrase that you used a few minutes ago, which is innovators, whether in big companies or in small companies and new ventures, if they're thinking inside out, which is if they're starting with the product, they're already in trouble. If you can start with the problem and work your way into what the product would be a much better and more healthy way to think about it. I'll give you one example here. We just updated our Crossing the Chasm book last year, and we didn't really want to, but the dean of the engineering school at Stanford came to us 2 years ago and said, I'm still using version 2 of your Crossing the Chasm book, but the examples are getting a little bit older. Can you come out with a new one so people under the age of 30 would recognize the name of the tech companies in the book? So we rewrote the book, added new ones in, Apple and Google and Salesforce and a whole host of things. But the one that we left in there was our very first client. And this actually relates to medicine and drug therapies.
Okay.
A company called Documentum, which was launched more than 15 years ago, was a spinoff out of a Xerox Labs that took analog information, paper-based data, and moved it into digital form. Do you remember, and some of us are old enough to remember this, when people are predicting, the the paperless office was going to occur by 1985. Wait a minute, maybe by 1990. We're still not quite paperless yet.
Right.
But this document engine software, which was hundreds of thousands of dollars in price, would promise to take a workflow that's currently paper-based and make it digital. Much more efficient, much more effective. So Documentum, the CEO came to us. His name was Jeff Miller. This is more than 15 years ago. And he said, we have a problem. We've identified 72 possible use cases, meaning 72 possible segments that could benefit from going from analog paper to digital. You can imagine what those are. Law firms, private institutions, schools, you name it, hospitals, healthcare facilities, state and local, 72. And he says, we know we have a problem because we only have 72 employees in our company. And with 72 possible segments, that's a bad ratio. So with our methodology, we took them from the 72 down to 50 in the scoring and rating and ranking. That was the easy part. Down to 33, down to 12, and then down to the final 3. And the top segment, we call it the beachhead segment for crossing, was one specific segment. Here's what it was. It was the top 40 pharmaceutical companies who are seeking FDA approval for new drug therapies and are trying to accelerate the approval process through their clinical trial process. That's how focused we are. And the target customer segment was the VP of Government Regulatory Affairs, who's measured on how fast can you get FDA approval. Their job is aligned for that.
Brilliant.
And it turns out that it's a relatively modest segment, but it was the top 40. It was Glaxo, Pfizer, Takeda, you name them.
Yeah.
And they all had the same problem. And the workflows that we identified was it was costing them about $1 million a day in delayed approval of an FDA drug because the patent, of course, is expiring before the approval for launch is actually given. So generics come out, as you all know, too quickly, and it cuts by about $1 million a day the cost of potential revenue growth. So our client, Documentum, focused on that as the first segment, put 80% of their sales effort into that one, and won 36 out of the top 40 pharma companies within 18 months. 36 out of 40. Pretty good batting average.
I mean, it just goes to show you how being hyper-targeted is so critical.
You think you're taking a risk when one does that. You're actually reducing. And then the second segment was medical device companies who have the same problem. And we're actually talking to the pharma companies about this solution. Mm-hmm. The third ones were the law firms who are then helping the others. So you get the idea. And then it exploded into a $3 billion business. They did all the hard work. We provided some workshops to do the scoring and rating, but the real hard work was done by the client. And it eventually got bought by EMC and then later by Dell. And so now it's a large multi-billion-dollar business inside a large mothership, but started off with one segment focus.
Wow.
And the funny anecdote on this, Dr. Roxy, is Jeff Miller was asked later in a Wall Street Journal interview, hey, wasn't that kind of risky to go from 72 possible segments to one? And he said, you know what? That was risky. You know what was more risky? Never focusing.
Right.
And doing the broad. And so I think this is very intuitive for some of your viewers on the podcast, but actually executing on that is quite hard. So that's the discipline and the systematic. So that's an example that I hope is fairly vivid for people in the call here today.
No, I think it's great. I think it's a great example. So in general, healthcare as a whole is a laggard. The industry is really typically late to implementing best practices around business and marketing. And, the system has been designed historically to where you could be wildly successful and not practice anything that we've learned in school. No, right? And so what I think is so fascinating is that you don't work just in healthcare. You work across all industries. Right. So help our listeners understand, is there one or two things that you've discovered that we haven't talked about yet that other industries are doing that healthcare could benefit from that might not be on their radar?
Okay, got it. Yeah. So a couple things around that. One is most of our work is B2B. We do some B2C work, but a lot of the healthcare work that you're describing and that you work with as well as business to business. What we see is two different planets. We see non-regulated industries where it's much easier to go to market.
Yep.
And we see regulated industries. So things like, for example, financial, which is SEC or Security Exchange Commission regulated, or medical, which is FDA regulated, of course, in the US. What we see is that sometimes healthcare makes an excuse that, it's so complex and we have regulatory pressure. Our answer would be is if you can really focus and identify, and it may not be 72 segments, but it might be 12, and get that down to the top 2 or 3, the lessons we've learned from vast large companies and from small ones. And the large companies are companies like Becton Dickinson, BD, or Thermo Fisher, or Agilent Life Sciences, or others. Those are all focused on, can we start with one specific workflow in mind? And that discipline actually came out of Silicon Valley, 15 or 20 years ago. And we think we've played a small part in having that occur. There's a misunderstanding that Silicon Valley and other tech hubs in Boston or Chicago or New York and other places, that this is basically, that they're always like managing and jumping into high risk situations. And the opposite is true.
Right.
Most great companies, even in Silicon Valley, started with a modest amount of risk and a smart level of focus. And I'll close on this one, which is the most successful company on the planet, and this is where healthcare can also learn from, has an incredibly complex supply chain. It's called Amazon. You've all heard of it a million times. Amazon, in their first 6 years of life, followed the F word very carefully, the focus word. What'd they do? They sold one product for 6 years. What was it? It was books. And they try to not solve world hunger. They focused on one area, built out the entire supply chain. How many healthcare companies would be as disciplined as that to actually focus on one key on the piano, on one particular product category, and solve that one first before they jump into all the others?
Absolutely. Words of wisdom right there, listeners.
Hopefully that helps in some of the great innovations that some of your viewers and listeners are working on the next 6 months, 12 months, and 18 months. And if there's a reason to put a systematic approach in place, I think the book that you've written, or our Crossing the Chasm book, or my LinkedIn site has some videos on it. Whatever resources somebody finds useful, use them and try to really have an outside-in perspective and not the product out perspective. It's the most dangerous thing you can get stuck in.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's really great. The last question I have for you today, and I think I told you this, Michael, before we started recording, we could go on for hours and days because I love this stuff. I know you do as well. And there's so much we could talk about, but we definitely have to wrap it up and get back to other things today. So the last question I want to leave you with is, with this explosion of innovation taking place in healthcare, there's a lot of innovators who are trying to sell their wares or their solutions to the same people, right? So yep. CIOs, product managers, everybody's inundated within the health system and the health plan providers with all those innovations. So what would be an example, one or two, of how you would suggest that some of these healthcare innovators rise above the noise?
Okay, got it. Yeah. So healthcare innovators, when you're thinking about what types of markets to go after, stop thinking about logos, meaning we're going to go after the Mayo Clinic or we're going to have to go after this large health organization, and focus more within the companies that you're going after at different job title levels. So it could be the CIO. It could be the people in charge of customer satisfaction and patient quality. It could be the CEO in small companies. If you say, well, anybody with a C level is the right target, that's too bland, too broad. And so a piece of advice would be is to go to the trade conferences, read the blogs, follow the people in different job titles. And by the way, LinkedIn, I'm not giving a plug for any reason other than I believe it. You can do great searches on LinkedIn by job title and by industry to find out really who the target is. And it could very well be that in a large health network, that one job title, like CEO, may not be the one with the problem. Yep. But the people in charge of health and customer satisfaction levels might be the pain point problem to go after. Sure. And so if you can put almost like a heat map out to say, where's the flare, where's the heat, where's the flame coming up, that's all about customer insight and customer development and not about product insight or product development. And so you're right, we could go on with this for several more hours, but hopefully this gives people at least an encapsulated view that says a lot of what you're doing right now as entrepreneurs is right, but the instincts you have about your early false positive successes in the early market, those don't translate into main market success. So it's almost as though you want to do a different mode in main market, and that's really what our books are about, and that's what we've been talking about here today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with our listeners today and with me. I certainly appreciate it. It's been a great discussion. How can people get a hold of you if they want to connect with you later? And then how can they get a copy of your book? So a lot of people I come across have read your book a decade ago. Sure. So how can they get the new version so they've got the current examples? Got it.
Great. So a couple things. One is if you want a really short snippet, I think, Dr. Roxy, that my office had sent you 6 or 8 slides. If people just want to keep it very simple and just ask for those, if you wouldn't mind sending those to people that are reaching out to you, that'd be great. The best way to reach me is on my LinkedIn page. We've got some videos and some other kind of blog examples of really the key errors that people make in innovation and venture and new breakthrough solution sets. So feel free to invite me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to accept. And then our book is available on Amazon. People are always available. We just came out with a new version, and that's on Amazon, and people can buy it there. I think there's an audio version too for those that are not readers, but are stuck in traffic over a multi-hour commute. Yeah. But in any case, I think what you and I have talked about today, aside from books and blogs and videos, is there's a fundamentally false set of assumptions about how great products go to market. And the reality is a systematic approach not a wheeling, dealing, high risk approach is a much smarter way to, play out the next 1 to 2 years before you really get to the main marketplace.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Well, thank you so much for joining us on the show today.
Thanks, Dr. Roxy. It was a pleasure.
What's the difference between launching and commercializing a healthcare innovation? Many people will launch a new product. Few will commercialize it. To learn the difference between launch and commercialization, and to watch past episodes of the show, head to our video show page at drroxy.com. Thanks so much for watching and listening to the show. You can subscribe to the latest episodes on your favorite podcast app, like Apple Podcasts and Spotify, or subscribe to the video episodes on our YouTube channel. No matter the platform, just search COIQ with Dr. Roxy. Until next time, let's raise our COIQ.